Good morning, everyone. You are very, very welcome to today's event. We'll be looking at the report on the 21st Century Readers, which is about developing literacy in a digital world. Now, today's event is hosted very kindly by the European Commission and the OECD and is supported by the Vodafone Germany Foundation. We're going to be talking a lot about some of the findings of the report. You will hear in the beginning the details of that, and then we will go into our discussion. Now, we've got a lot of high-level speakers for you today, so we do want to hear your thoughts and your questions to them. To do that, you can use the chat function. You should see the icon either at the bottom of your screen, and then it will pop up in a little window to the right. Please try and keep your questions concise and clear, and if they're directed at one specific speaker, please indicate that as well. If you wish to, it would also be lovely to have your name and organization that you are coming from, but do get those questions in there. We do want to hear from you so that we can really have a good roundtable discussion. Now, of course, time is, as always, very tight in these events. We are not going to be able to solve all the problems of the world in an hour and a half, so we may not get to all your questions, but we will be doing our best to collate them and really come up with as many good responses as possible. With that, I think we are ready to hand over to our first speaker, who is Paus, the Chairwoman of the Vodafone Germany Foundation and Managing Director at the Vodafone Institute for Society and Communications. Inga, over to you.
Thanks, Jennifer. On behalf of the Vodafone Germany Foundation, I would like to welcome all of you to this event on 21st Century Readers. We are now 1 year into the COVID-19 pandemic, and what we've seen is that students in Europe, but also around the world, have spent an unprecedented amount of their time in the digital sphere. And this is great because digital technologies allow them to keep up education and social interaction in a time of physical distancing, but it also confronts them with an enormous amount of information. And some of this information is misleading, and some of this information is outright false. This is why the World Health Organization is speaking of an infodemic, which spreads across the globe alongside the pandemic. And the infodemic has actually underscored what we knew since a while. We will need a completely new set of digital literacy skills in an information age. That means concretely, we will need to be able to validate information sources, to detect biased information, but also to construct meaning from information coming from diverse sources. And being able to navigate the internet and social media in a sovereign way is key to participating in a digital society. Moreover, it will be key to keep up our vibrant and healthy democracies. And clearly, the ambitious goals of the Digital Decade strategy of the EU will only be achieved if we have a solid foundation of digital literacy skills among European citizens. Thus, the 21st Century Readers Report by the OECD, which the Vodafone Germany Foundation supported, is coming at a crucial point of time. It analyzes the changing nature of literacy. It identifies important gaps of digital literacy skills of young students. And moreover, it provides promising insights how to address these gaps. And today's event is about taking this report as a starting point and looking ahead. And I'm therefore really delighted that we've got a distinguished panel of experts to discuss how we can make education in Europe more inclusive and more relevant for the digital age. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists which are joining us today. First of all, Viviane Hoffmann from the European Commission, Andreas Schleicher from the OECD, and Joakim Reiter from Vodafone. And now I've got the special privilege to announce the EU Commissioner for Innovation, Research, Culture and Youth, Ms. Mariya Gabriel, who took a keen interest in the report and will kick off this event with a video message. I wish us all insightful 90 minutes and will hand it over to Commissioner Gabriel now.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to address you today. I warmly welcome the launch of the PISA report 21st Century Readers of the OECD and the Vodafone Germany Foundation. The report is very timely. Screens are becoming a window to the world, and it is important to ensure that young people have the skills to navigate safely and responsibly the sea of information and knowledge. This report provides a valuable insight on how to best support our 15-year-olds in their journey in the digital age, making them truly knowledgeable and enlightened readers, but also citizens in the digital 21st century. The digital world offers great opportunities to learn, discover, collaborate, and create. However, it comes with its very own rules. Algorithms decide what kind of information we access. News inflate quickly and suddenly, reaching millions of users through echo chambers, which do not necessarily distinguish between real and fake. This is a highly fertile ground for the spread of unverified content and disinformation. Every day, 1 in 3 Europeans comes across news that they believe do not represent reality or are even false. In a recent survey, 74% of respondents expressed concern about fake news on the coronavirus. Today, more than ever, citizens need to be able to make a critical assessment. Identifying information needs, finding and retrieving data, assessing the relevance of content are among the key components of digital competence in the 21st century. Young people in particular must learn how to make informed choices and how to fully benefit from the digital transformation. I strongly believe that education and training play a fundamental role in this regard. Yet in the 2019 Eurobarometer survey, 41% of young people shared that critical thinking and media are not sufficiently taught in school. This is a clear message to our education systems, and it requires an adequate response. Media and digital literacy are also among my priorities. Let me give you 3 examples. First, with the new Digital Education Action Plan, we have set clear goals. We'll develop guidelines for teachers and educators to promote digital literacy and address disinformation. We'll soon launch a call for an expert group to help us in this endeavor. Our aim is to present the guidelines in the autumn of next year. Second, the annual theme of e-twinning for 2021 is media literacy and disinformation. I launched the e-twinning spring campaign. It provided resources and new ideas on how to be smart online to more than 8,000 e-twinners who joined the group for media literacy and disinformation. I will continue to lead the e-twinning campaign this autumn. Finally, the Erasmus Plus program, with its reinforced budget, will support the objectives of the Digital Education Action Plan and will play an important role in mobilizing education, training, and youth communities against disinformation. Since 2014, the program funded over 2,600 projects on media literacy and disinformation, with a budget of more than 241 million euros. Ladies and gentlemen, improving the digital skills and media and digital literacy of our citizens, especially young people, should remain high on our agenda. This is important if our society wants to thrive in the digital age. I do appreciate your efforts in this direction, and I wish you a successful event.
And of course, we're very grateful to the Commissioner for taking the time there to share her thoughts with us and to support the whole project. And also, Inga, thank you very much to you, not only for your introduction, but also for all the hard work. Now, we're going to move on. I see we've got more than 100 attendees from all around the world. I see Cambodia, Indonesia, North Macedonia. So although it's unfortunate that we have to do this digitally and not be able to meet in person, we are really pleased with the reach you get with these digital tools. So it's important to see the benefits of what we can see. The infodemic during the pandemic is obviously very much top of people's minds at the moment, and I'm sure we will touch on that a lot. So let's try and keep the balance and discuss all the benefits and the potential, as well as the pitfalls we've found over the last year. And with that, I'm going to hand over now to the Director for the Directorate of Education and Skills and the Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Secretary-General of the OECD, Andreas Schleicher. Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And also thank you, Inga, for all your support for this work and more generally for the engagement you take for supporting digital literacy and education in the world in which we live. Clearly, as everybody has said so far, we just heard this from the Commissioner, we live in a dramatically changing world where technology has changed every aspect of our lives. If you think through the last 20 years where we conducted PISA, at the beginning, the digital work was, for specialists. It wasn't in everybody's life. But then you could see, the iPhone appearing. You could see social media coming in. Artificial intelligence thinking is changing the way we think, the way we work. Dramatic changes in the world, in our lives through technology. But if you look at education, if you think about the literacy skills that young people have to navigate this technological world, they've barely seen any change in the principal industrialized countries, the OECD countries. More or less in 2018, where we were in the year 2000. The gap between what our societies expect and what education delivers hasn't become smaller, it's become significantly wider. And we can put a number to this issue around fake news. We can see that on average across OECD countries, less than half of 15-year-olds can reliably distinguish fact from opinion. In texts they would encounter every day. These were not particularly complicated material. This was sort of reading material that you'd find every day. Less than half are equipped for this. You can say it's a little bit better than it was in the year 2000, but we live in a totally different world. In the year 2000, young people were largely, reading linear texts, printed books that were carefully curated and often government approved for schools. When you had a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia, you could trust that answer, you find that to be true. Today, you look up things on Google or wherever, and you'll find 100,000 answers to your question, and nobody will tell you what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge, it's about constructing knowledge, a very different skill set. But, let's start from the beginning, technology use. Reading in the digital world sort of assumes technology. So we looked at access and use of computers. And what you can actually see is that 15-year-olds spend often a full working week on the internet. You can see countries where this exceeds 40 hours. Much of that happens out of school. That's the green segment. But you can also see, in countries like Denmark, Sweden, or New Zealand, school contributes a lot to that. What I'm showing you here is that the digital world has become the real world for many young people now. So that's the reality in which we live, but not everybody has access. That's the other side of the coin. Now, what we can see here is in countries like, Denmark, all students have access to a computer linked to the internet that they can use for schoolwork. And a couple of other countries where that is true as well. But even in a high-tech country like Japan, when you think about Japan, you think about, cameras, mobile phones, everything. But, for young people, access is far from a reality. There's a big kind of social gap being left. And if you look beyond the OECD membership on the left side here, towards the kind of more emerging economies, that gap gets actually very, very significant. Well, that's the reality, the digital divide that we still encounter. But the positive side is that we have seen a lot of progress being made on this now. You can see, for example, a country like Iceland or a country like Korea, they've always been at the frontier. Even in 2003, when we started that series, you could see 90% of young people having access to a computer that they can use for schoolwork. It's linked to the internet now. But, if you look to the United States, they used to be quite good, but they have not become much better. So today, by today's standards, that's actually where access is still much more limited. When you look at the Russian Federation or Latvia or the Slovak Republic, in 2003, you can see that blue box there very much at the low end. 1 in 10, maybe 2 in 10 young people had access to a computer. But now it's 9 out of 10, more than 9 out of 10. So actually what you can see across the board, we have seen quite good progress on this front. The digital divide, the access to computers, that's going to be hopefully a problem of the past. If we look at, more traditional cultural capital, it's a quite different story. When you can see, for example, here that students from privileged backgrounds have a very rich background of books at home. And we know that is a good predictor for many important outcomes in life. But when you look at students from disadvantaged backgrounds, you can see actually it's got from bad to worse. Actually, the kind of gap, the social gap in cultural capital has not closed like it does for digital technologies, but it's actually widening. It should concern us. I'm going to come back to this. So how are schools using technology? That's obviously an important question that we ask ourselves. And I want to start with a big picture, broad picture. You can see sort of almost 40% of cases in a kind of language class where you can see both the teacher and the students use technology for learning, for teaching. Now then you can see another share where technology is just used by students. So it's not part of the instructional design, but students use computers. You have also a significant share of teacher use. Now where teachers use computer to prepare material, to present material, and so on. And then you have a limited share where computers are not being used. So you can see actually how technology now makes its way into classrooms according to the PISA outcomes. But the most disconcerting finding is this one. Now, we can basically see that the correlation between technology intensity in class, in school, and learning outcomes, digital literacy, tends to be negative for most of the activities that we looked at. Now, whether it's about playing simulations at school, posting work on the school's website, doing homework, downloading or uploading, browsing material, and so on. That's sort of something which should, make us jump up, that actually the way we use technology today in the classroom tends to often distract, not add to the value add of learning. That is not, saying something negative about technology. That is saying that we need to become so much better in the pedagogical design to meaningfully integrate technology so that we can walk along the kind of best examples that we see today. There are amazing examples where technology fundamentally transforms learning, making learning so much more interactive, so much more granular, so much more participative, so much more social. But, if you look at this at scale, you still find more negative experiences than positive ones. There is a lot of homework to be done by our school systems. There's one area where we find a positive correlation of browsing the internet for schoolwork. Now, where that happened more, you could see school students doing better in literacy. But even there, in some countries on the right side, it's a positive effect. But even here, you can see a number of countries where it's working out negatively. So even something obvious like this doesn't seem to work consistently across countries. Now, another important aspect is this story of fake news. Let me come back to this. When you look at this at the surface, what knowledge do students have for assessing the credibility of sources? You ask them, what do you do when you see an email with a link? I'm going to click on this, or do you look at the sender? All of those kinds of questions. You can see actually in some countries, you can see here on the left side, countries like United Kingdom, Japan, Germany. That's easy for students. They have that theoretical knowledge. But in other countries on the right side, students do not even know where to start. So they do not even have those theoretical foundations to navigate fake news, not to speak of applying that knowledge. We also see this is an area with huge social gaps. Now you can see basically when you look at the triangle or the diamond, that telling you, the difference between students from privileged backgrounds and disadvantaged ones. And you can see actually that is a significant gap. And that should be worrying us, because obviously it's going to be the disadvantaged students that are more exposed to, the kind of criminal activities of fake news and the implications of that. So that's an issue, I think, despite, generally students being quite knowledgeable, that doesn't hold for all of the groups. But the real story is this. Now, this is basically where we look at the relationship between, your capacity to actually distinguish fact from opinion and your theoretical knowledge about this. Remember, countries like Germany and the UK and Japan were doing very well on the theoretical knowledge. But when it comes to the capacity of students to actually distinguish fake news from, facts in a real context, in a real kind of task setting, you can see students in Britain did even better than predicted, and students in Germany did a lot worse than predicted. And so, yeah, the theoretical knowledge is a starting point, but it doesn't guarantee that you can actually, navigate complex and ambiguous information. There's something more going on. Another question is, what can we do about this to bring those kind of dots more closely in line? And actually, our data show that schools can make a very significant contribution to this. You can see, for example, where students were more experiencing, where they were more taught how to decide whether to trust information from the internet, where that happened in the classroom, students were better at navigating, opinion and facts. Where there was more, students were more taught how to compare the different web pages and decide what information was more relevant, same story. Where students were taught how to understand the consequences of making information public available, sharing something on Facebook, on Twitter, and so on, the same story. And where students were taught how to detect whether the information is subjective or biased, you could see generally that actually they were doing better on this. So schools can make a real difference on this. And this is, for example, you just saw that Germans were good theoretically, but not able to apply it. And surprise, surprise, when you ask them these kinds of questions, German students say, well, I've never learned to do those kinds of things. So again, the classroom, digital, educating for the digital age is about those kinds of phenomena. We can actually change that student mindset and capacity with proper instruction. So let's go to the navigation of information. We looked at this in quite some detail. Now, how competent are students actually, to use the internet strategically, to search for information intentionally and navigate the web. Everybody knows that you can get easily lost on the web. You click on something else, and then, suddenly you don't know where you are anymore. So what we can see is that in some countries, students are highly effective navigators of the internet. Now, they're very intentional and they never get distracted. And all of those countries or most of those countries are in Asia. You can see Hong Kong, you can see Singapore, you can see Japan, you can see the regions of China that we cover, Korea, the Russian Federation, and so on. That's something in other areas, students have great difficulties navigating effectively. We have another group of countries where students are still good to actively explore. They may not, use the internet so strategically, but, they, go back when they found a mistake, and they sort of do that still intentionally. But, what you can also see here, it puts most of the East Asian countries even further ahead of the rest of the world. And then you have students where we can see, well, if you give them a single source, they can manage, but they can't, navigate multiple sources on the internet. And most concerning is you have often a majority of students at age 15 who can't demonstrate any meaningful, navigation. They just, click, 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 and so on. So actually, when people talk about digital natives, that means people are born with technology, but it doesn't mean that people have the skills to actively use technology and not to be distracted, not to be misled. This chart, should strike us. There's a lot to do for us to make students ready for the digital world. Now, digital natives is not something that we become by birth, we become by education. And of course, that has implications. You can see basically that there's a very close link between the navigation competency and students' digital literacy. Now, if you want to get to, level 5 and 6 on a PISA test, the kind of most advanced levels of proficiency, you need to be pretty good at strategically navigating information. And it's not just, digital information is the same on print. Print material can mislead us equally. Often we need to compare, contrast, critique, analyze, and so on. It's the same kind of strategic capabilities. They're short in supply, but they're very predictive on learning outcomes as we see them. Let me sort of just give you a quick sense of what students actually do on the internet. Reading emails has become sort of less popular. You can see in most countries, it used to be quite popular, 80, 90, 70% of students doing that. But if you look in 2018, email is sort of a bit out of fashion among young people. They use other means of communication. When you look at online discussion groups or forums, that's basically something where we have seen surprisingly little change over the last decade. Now you can see in some countries on the left, it has become less popular. In countries on the right, it's become more popular, but not a big shift. It's more a sideways movement in this. This is about, taking part in online discussion groups or forums. Now, chatting online clearly has become more popular. And some countries on the right, enormously so. Look at, Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Kazakhstan, Thailand, and so on. And other countries on the left, it has always been popular, very little change. But you can basically say now, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 young people are actually, very active chatters. So basically the kind of social media, social communication is a very important dimension of online technologies. Online news, how do you inform yourself? And of course, this is where the kind of potential for fake news comes in very prominently. Much more popular now than it was in the year 2009. Not in all countries, but in most countries. Now, again, you look at Kazakhstan, Thailand, Indonesia, Ireland, Albania, the Russian Federation, Malaysia, Mexico, Jordan, and so on. You can see many more young people are reading news online. Not as many as actually chatting. You can see we are now in the area of, 50, 60%, but still it's quite popular. Then you can see searching for information. Now, when I look at information on a particular topic, become more popular almost everywhere where we have data, not mostly for countries on the right. You can say basically sort of searching for information on the internet is something very, very common. 60, 70, sometimes 80% of young people are doing that on a very regular basis. And the same is true when we look at searching for practical information online. That's also become a lot more popular than it used to be. Now, that's about reading competency. That's about the literacy skills for the digital world. But let's not forget about, enjoyment for reading. It's actually a very powerful predictor for students' habits and behaviors in many areas. So it's something that we should be looking to. One of the striking features is that in some countries, enjoyment for reading has dramatically decreased. Look here at Germany or the Netherlands, where it used to be low and it's got worse. In other countries, we can see things have improved. You look here, for example, to Uruguay, to Costa Rica, and so on. So it's gone in both directions in different countries. Now, isn't that interesting? It's not something where you can say the digital world has sort of made reading less enjoyable, but you can say in some countries, changes have had that kind of shape, in others not. So I think that's very important. What we see, and that's really important, is that enjoyment of reading is a very powerful predictor for digital literacy. Now, where students enjoy to read, they are much better navigators of complex information. They are much more active readers and so on. And I'm doing much better on the PISA test. So enjoyment of reading, even after accounting for, social background and demography and gender and so on, you can see a big difference. It's also, one of the big explanatory factors why girls tend to read so much better than boys in the digital world, because they like to read, they enjoy reading more than boys do so. One of the, interesting features, unfortunately, I don't have data for all countries, but for many, is that there is a link in many between what parents do and what their 15-year-old students do. So you can see actually parental behavior seems to provide a very important context for student enjoyment in reading. And virtually all of the countries for which we have data, you can see that kind of positive interaction between what happens, by parents and what happens by students now. And certainly, for young children, there's a lot that parents can do to create a climate where, reading is fun, reading is enjoyable, and reading is something that, is a habit that is taking place now. We can see that somehow also relates to the format of material that students read. You can see, for example, where students read books more often on digital devices, they enjoyed reading a little bit more than students who do not read. Where they read books in paper format, they typically enjoyed it more. But where they did both, where students use both digital devices and paper format, they were the ones that enjoyed reading mostly among the students group for which we have data. So I think that's something we should keep in mind. What is quite striking is now when you link all of this to reading performance, to digital literacy, you can see, and isn't that surprising, that where students read books more often in paper format, they were actually better to navigate the digital world than where students primarily read digital information. So it is not so much whether you actually read digital material that you're good at navigating digital material. It's the metacognitive strategies that students deploy that enable them to become good readers. You can teach them in paper format, you can teach them in digital format, but it's basically your capacity to understand what you know that actually enables you. And sometimes those things seem to be better taught even in a more kind of traditional environment than in the kind of very abstract. Reading at school, bringing you back once more. Now you can see, for example, where students read fiction more, you can see that the reading outcomes are best. But also for documents and graphs and so on, that also contributes to better reading outcomes. Now we can see that generally positive outcomes. But it's often, quite complex information, reading complex information that seems to be, predictive of better digital skills. What's also interesting, bringing you back to the topic of enjoyment, where students read fiction for school more, they tend to also read fiction for enjoyment at home more. So we do not know what the causal nature of that relationship is. It could probably go both ways, but there seems to be a link, doing something at school and doing something at home when it comes to, enjoyment you draw from doing, and the school can therefore contribute to this. Now, if you ask yourselves, what are the predictors at school that drive success? As I already said, the knowledge of reading strategies for assessing the credibility of sources was a very important predictor. So teachers being conscious about teaching students, this is how you detect, the truth in the information. This is how you navigate, triangulate, contrast, critique. The knowledge of reading strategies for writing a summary, where students were able to conceptually design, summarize, put things together. They were better navigators of the digital world. You could see, you can teach it in the print format, it's going to be valuable in the digital world. Self-efficacy, to what extent am I willing to, overcome difficult struggle? My perceived competence in reading, all of those things made a difference. But for the perceived competency, this is a double-edged sword. We have, for example, generally boys were thinking, the reading test in PISA is easy, and they were doing worse than the girls who thought the test was harder. So maybe, it's about giving students a more realistic appreciation of their strengths and weaknesses. Last but not least, long texts. We looked at the length of the text. You can see the, share of students that read, short and middle-length documents, and the share of students that are used to reading documents of 100 pages or more. You can see, for example, here Finland or Denmark or Canada, United Kingdom, Chile. Now you can see basically where students are used to read long and complex documents. And what's interesting actually, that this is also a predictor of digital literacy. Now, whereas students are reading more lengthy, complex documents, they tend to be better at navigating, complex information, distinguishing fact from opinion, and things like this. So, we shouldn't throw away, long text and think, well, everything is now, 140 or 280 character messages. No, actually, complex texts are a good way to get students ready for the digital world. And that brings me to the very last point. What do young people think about their future? We looked at this and we actually saw that, where the reading happens by the students' career expectations. And you can see students who were aiming to become health professionals at age 15, obviously, students may not know so well. The reading was one of their favorite hobbies. Now, it's the same, a little less, but similarly for science and engineering professionals, less so for science-related technicians, and a lot less so for ICT professionals. Now, people who want to go into technology usually say, no, reading is not really my major hobby. then you can see the same picture when you think, I like to talk about books with other people. People who are going into health and sciences, for them, the world of reading material, the world of books is something that, is important to their lives. They like to talk about it. When you look at the other end of the spectrum, you can see, for example, many people who go into or want to go into computer science or become, science-related technicians. They say, well, I only read to get the information that I really need. Or even for me, reading is really a waste of time. Once again, we do not know what's cause and effect, but what we can see is that probably the reading behaviors, the habits that young people have, may be quite predictive for the world that they see in front of them and the kind of occupations that are open to them. Basically, giving young people a strong foundation in reading can be a very, very important predictor for enabling them to success. So, in conclusion, the gap between what our societies need in terms of the reading skills and what education systems provide has become wider, not narrow. We need to redouble our efforts to give young people the skills they need to become successful in tomorrow's world. The fact that less than half of 15-year-olds cannot distinguish reliably between fact and opinion is really deeply worrying in the world in which we live. And it's also clear from the data that you saw that they often do not learn about those things in school. The first prerequisite towards fostering digital literacy is technology, but there we're seeing good progress. You can see, the digital divide, the first digital divide being closing. And that's something, we're not seeing when it comes to cultural capital, books at home. But it's just the beginning. Schools can also do so much more to help students develop effective reading strategies, particularly those who are in disadvantage and who receive less stimulation from their teachers. Now, that's also worrying that actually those who need it most, students from disadvantaged backgrounds, often say, my teacher actually helps me less. Schools obviously can also use technology more effectively. So you could see that at the moment we have to acknowledge that technology seems sometimes more to hinder than to help learning, and schools need to give students a more realistic sense of their strengths and weaknesses. Now, the fact that boys find the reading test easier but consistently score worse than girls tells us, that's not happening yet. And at the end of the day, we will only be successful if students truly enjoy what they do, and that is reading. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed, Andreas. Yes, we see lots of people commenting on your slides. Absolutely fascinating. Jensen Button saying it's great to see data suggesting that a reading for pleasure culture at school actually impacts on digital literacy. He says that's absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure many people want to get their hands on those slides. So there is a link in the chat where you can go and see them because obviously there's really a lot of detail in there. Some people asking questions about the different metrics, but we'll come on to that in due course. But now I would like to introduce our next couple of panelists. We have Viviane Hoffmann, who is the Deputy Director-General at the Directorate-General of the Education, Youth, Sport and Culture in the European Commission. Thank you very much, Viviane, for being with us. And as we said, Joakim Reiter, Trustee of the Vodafone Foundation and External Affairs Director at the Vodafone Group. Viviane, perhaps I can hand over to you first to get your initial thoughts and reactions to the report.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking you for this invitation. I'm really delighted to learn about the results of the PISA report, which was prepared by the OECD and the Vodafone Germany Foundation. This is extremely interesting, it's extremely timely and extremely useful also for our work. And indeed, critical reading and the way we react to information, the way we engage with information, and any type of content has always been fundamental for effective democracies, for development in our societies. This is not something new as such. However, with the digital transformation, the increased time everybody spends online, the amount of information we are exposed to, the way we engage with it, assess it, share it, has changed dramatically. And this is why this report is so important today. This environment calls clearly for new skills and competences that help apply critical thinking in an online world and a better understanding of its specificities. And therefore, I think it's important to stress that being digitally competent is both a necessity, but also a right. It means that for being able to participate actively and responsibly in society at all levels, we need to take advantage of the benefits and the opportunities of the online world while building understanding and resilience to potential risks. Now, you may know that the European Commission adopted last year a new digital education action plan for the years to come. And we carried out an open public consultation before preparing this action plan. And the results were also very interesting. According to the respondents, the three most important digital competencies are related to engaging with information online. And these three key competencies are indeed identifying facts from fake information online, managing the overload of information, and navigating safely online while protecting personal data and privacy. And still, as was very clear now in Andreas's presentation, there are persisting gaps in the levels of digital competencies. And young people are particularly exposed due to the amount of time they spend online. According to the International Computer and Information Literacy Study from 2018, 1/3 of young people between 13 and 14 years old underperform in information and computer literacy. So this, of course, makes them more likely to be exposed to disinformation or manipulation, reinforced by echo chambers and information bubbles. Lack of awareness of algorithms and precisely information bubbles put people more at risk online. And indeed, the same study also confirmed this correlation between underperformance in information literacy and disadvantaged socio-economic conditions. So this brings me to another point, which is equity and equality vis-à-vis digitization and the importance of critical thinking and reading for social cohesion. I'm happy to see this point is addressed in the PISA report that is the object of our discussion today. We know that young people coming from disadvantaged backgrounds are less likely to have proper or easy or appropriate access to the internet and to have the necessary skills and competencies to evaluate the sources of information, and therefore they risk suffering from further inequalities and even marginalization and social exclusion, and also to be more vulnerable possibly to hate speech and online threats and other risk factors. So this is why high quality, effective, inclusive digital education plays a key role in supporting young people in this complex environment. Every young European should be equipped with the necessary skills and competencies to live and thrive in this digital age. And I'm talking obviously about Europe and the European Union, but I think this is universal. And this will make people confident and socially engaged, but also help them development critical thinking in an increasingly complex world. And whoever masters the competence of critical reading and information engagement is also more likely to look for more diverse information sources. So this all lies at the core of our Digital Education Action Plan, which outlines the Commission's vision for education and training in the digital age. And I'll probably have a chance later to say a few more words, but maybe I'll stop here for now.
Thank you. Yes, you've touched on many of the things that I'm going to get into a little bit more detail. In particular, the findings of that PISA report, it identifies straight away the digital divide, which is, of course, an issue even within Europe as well as wider fields. The opportunity to learn, navigating digital environments, these are all the key areas that have been identified. So we'll talk about those in detail. But now, Joakim, I'll turn to you and ask whether there was anything surprising for you. I mean, obviously reports go into it to find things out, but sometimes we have expectations before we see the results. You think you're on mute?
Hi. So not necessarily surprising. I think it's more a question around the importance of having this discussion. And we, the report rightly points out, and as a parent, I worry quite a lot about the fact that you're digitally native. In case of my kids or the young generation we have today, doesn't mean that they're digitally skilled. And it's a very, very important point. The second point, actually, which the report doesn't necessarily surface in a brutal way, but I think we should discuss it, is digital in itself, and that comes to the point where we talk about length of reading, drives instant gratification. And so what we see is that you have digitally native, not necessarily digitally skilled, and increasingly young people looking for instant gratification. And that undermines fundamentally their ability to build the patience that is required for critical thinking in terms of reading, in terms of searching, in terms of verifying facts. So it goes to the heart of something that is very, very important, I think, for all of us. All of us here are not going back to school, but all of us have either children or grandchildren, and there's a fundamental shift in the conditions of their education compared to when we went to school. I think that's one aspect that I think is really important. The other one, which Andreas touched upon in the last one, and I leave that as a homework for me to start thinking about, how come people that want to go into the sector that I represent are the ones that perhaps wants to read the least? And what does that mean in terms of the wealth of knowledge and the ability of critical thinking that you need in order to develop the ICT technologies? Because what we often overlook is digital is not a sector. Digital is not a particular development in one part of our society. It now permeates every aspect of our life, which means that those that are promulgating and driving and accelerating the digital transformation of our society, including companies like us, have a huge societal responsibility and need to develop both the technologies, and the people involved in developing the digital transformation needs to be mindful of the impact it has on every aspect of people's lives. And I think that's a shout out that comes out of this. And therefore we need actually every person, no matter whether you end up in the ICT sector or something else, to be digitally empowered and digitally able, so that the way that they interact with technology and the way that they embrace technology is in a manner that drives the societal change that we're looking for, rather than taking us off on a tandem that we have seen from time to time with certain digital technologies, where we're now rapidly trying to wrap our arms around because the negative impact has been quite significant. So I'll stop there, because I think this is a really, really good report, but I look forward to covering some more detailed comments later on.
Thank you. You've certainly set out one of the challenges for us today, which is to try and tease apart the different areas where sort of digital critical thinking could have an impact. I see someone actually in the chat has already said, why are we just focusing on young people? Well, that's the topic for today. But of course, people of our older generation and older age could learn a thing or two as well. Certainly not saying we couldn't. There's a lot of questions coming in already. So let me dive straight into those, Andreas. We have a question here from Tamara and Vandana asking essentially the same thing. Is digital literacy the same as general media skills? And perhaps I'd like to tease out a little bit more as well, drawing on something Joakim said, which is about younger people being digital natives. But being able to use digital tools isn't the same as being able to understand how they're made, or indeed even being a creator of those tools themselves. And that can leave you at a disadvantage if all you do is click and click and click, rather than, so digital native doesn't necessarily mean highly skilled. Is that something that came up in your studies?
Yeah, digital literacy and media literacy are obviously related, but I would not say they are the same. Media literacy you also need in the print kind of world. You need to sort of be able to triangulate information. You need to sort of compare. You need to relate different information sources, assess their credibility. That's what you need in both areas. But I think what is new in the digital world is that you need to build a mental representation of much larger information spaces you don't have in front of you. In the print world, you have something in front of you. You can walk through this linear. In the digital world, you actually need to imagine the kind of potential sources that you could draw on, and I think that makes reading a much more complex phenomenon. And so, yeah, I think you need they have things in common, but they have also things that are different, and that's why I think when we teach both digital literacy and I like to pick up a point that Joakim just made. It requires patience, it requires diligence, it requires the capacity, to think beyond the boundary of what I have just in front of me. And I think those things need to be taught in the right instructional settings. And you will not succeed with this if you just push information on young people. You need to draw on their intrinsic motivation, their intrinsic interest in this. That's why the enjoyment factor is so important. And I think that's where, the challenge really lies. I think we have treated literacy in the past as a technique. You just, learn how to sort of process certain information. But what we're talking here is far more than a technique. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of working. It's a way of navigating ambiguity.
Well, let me just quickly bounce back on that. Can you teach enjoyment?
Well, I think you can create an environment in which students start to sort of enjoy what they do. I think if you as a teacher are very, very good at, understanding what, the dreams and passions of your students are, if you understand who they are and who they want to become, you can give them an environment where they can develop their skills. And I think they start to enjoy things. In a way, I think when students do things they enjoy, they have endless energy. They can spend, hours and hours on that kind of subject. When they don't, I think you have a very, very hard time as a teacher. And I think, the good instructional environment foster enjoyment. Why am I so confident about this? Look at the huge between country variation in this. You have some education systems where virtually every student enjoys reading. There must be something that they do differently than in countries where we see generally enjoyment of reading is not present or has actually declined.
Yeah, so we just need to find their secret sauce, I guess. Viviane, let me ask you, a question from Adele has come in saying, how can we promote digital literacy? Let me expand that. What is it you think the EU and national governments need to provide beyond just the basic infrastructure and connectivity, the digital ecosystem, which is obviously the sort of the underpinning, but what more can countries or EU do to help these 21st century readers thrive?
Yes, thank you very much. I refer back to the Digital Education Action Plan. It sets out the long-term strategy of digital education that we would like to help develop in Europe and also contributes to the broader objectives for Europe in the digital age. And of course, all the issues that we address from this longer-term perspective were made extremely clear and urgent throughout the corona pandemic. But now we are looking at the strategic priorities. What can the EU do? What can we do together with the member states? Because obviously the member states themselves are responsible for education and training. However, challenges across member states are very similar, and therefore solutions can be more effective if they are addressed jointly through cooperation and exchange between them. Now, we have developed two legs under this action plan, and one is indeed to foster a high-performing digital ecosystem, a digital education ecosystem. But on the other hand, of course, we have proposed a number of tools to develop skills and competencies. So what do I mean by that? Of course, infrastructure, connectivity, digital equipment are of great importance. And as was explained before, we saw existing gaps widening through the COVID crisis and new ones opening very distinctively. So this is something that that needs to be addressed, and member states such as Bulgaria, Ireland, Poland, to name just a few, took initiatives to provide digital equipment to students in need. So this is important, and we also hope that member states will make use of the EU's Recovery and Resilience Facility instrument to further address these needs. But these, of course, are the baseline: infrastructure, connectivity, digital equipment, and they are so important, but then they need to be complemented by what we call the digital education ecosystem. And this also involves that we further support capacity building, planning at a more organizational level to help education and training institutions to have themselves long-term and comprehensive strategies that are integrated in the teaching and learning process. So equipment, yes, pedagogical approaches, indeed, and this can be supported by a number of tools that we offer, for instance, the Erasmus Plus program.
Well, I want Joakim to build on what Viviane has been saying and ask you whether this is the role only for the state alone and only regarding funding. I mean, there is a role for civil society and NGOs. Some of those hardware schemes that Viviane mentioned, I think, were actually created and supported by civil society and NGOs getting the tablets to the kids. So what role do you see there?
Well, I think the number, Viviane is absolutely right. The COVID crisis both provided an enormous injection actually in digitization of education system and the need to digitize, and it's exposed existing digital divides that are increasingly becoming life determining in terms of future generation or parts of our society. And someone asked the question earlier on whether, for example, Vodafone looks at digital skills as purely as something for young. No, absolutely not. When we talk about SMEs' lack of digital maturity, a lot of it emanates from lack of digital skills among the entrepreneurs that represent the SME sector. Same when we talk about healthcare transformation. Our healthcare system, who now needs to deal with a massive backlog in terms of treatment of non-COVID related diseases and conditions, are actually embracing digital, but as part of that, struggle with their own systems digital skills. In other words, how do you leverage it for your own transformation? So I do think that just as we talk about SME sector, just as we talk about healthcare sector, the educational system needs to embrace what has been one of the learnings of COVID, which is if you are not digitizing your education system, you run the risk of getting that lost generation that we're already now discussing, and the huge implication it has not only for the individuals involved, but also for the future of society and future of our economy. So Viviane is absolutely right, and I really want to congratulate her for the Digital Education Action Plan. I think it's a really good blueprint for us to chart a way forward. I think in the case of Vodafone, and that's why we don't think it's something that is purely government, as with the healthcare system, the same with the education system, we need the state to lead the way, but we need all actors to lean in. And there are different things that we can do to collaborate and help support the government in its ambitions to both digitize the education system and improve the digital skills embedded into the education system. And if I take Vodafone, for example, for us, there are basically three things. And just to be very clear, we have always focused on social inclusion, or digital inclusion as we call it, under a digital society. And for us, in the case of inclusion, a very important pillar for us is the education system and how we support digital skills. But it starts first and foremost with the way that we make sure that we connect all schools, all children, and all libraries. So infrastructure is a very important part. And in the COVID crisis, the first lockdown in Europe, we actually increased our capacity on network with 60% over and above the normal investment cycle. So we just plowed capacity into the network because we realized when everyone was moving home, no matter if it's entrepreneurs or kids or people that have to work from home or access to healthcare, everyone would go online. The network isn't built for everyone to be online at the same time. That's not how network works. So of course, all of us as Vodafone, but also the whole of the industry, had to devote enormous amount of capital just to lift up the system so that it could transition and manage the transition that happened in society, where every one of us, in the way that we worked, educated ourselves, accessed healthcare, went online. So that, of course, is true. And there, Viviane is right. We would strongly encourage member states to identify under the RRF, the EU Reconstruction Fund, investments into digital, connecting, for example, schools, or connecting libraries and stuff like that. The second thing is products and services, and that's both on commercial grounds and non-commercial grounds. So we, as a company, have, of course, targeted products and services for vulnerable groups in society. That's absolutely essential if you want to drive more social cohesion, as Viviane referred to. And it makes no sense not to have more targeted propositions, because this situation for different groups in society is different, and therefore you need to cater for their needs. And we do that both on commercial grounds and non-commercial grounds. Just to give you a sense, on non-commercial grounds, for example, in this crisis, we zero-rated access to educational and e-learning platforms, so that kids would not have a problem with their data bundles and how much their subscription is in order to access educational material. We just made sure that everything was zero-rated, and any kid should have the right to access the e-learning platforms that governments and other institutions provided. And then the final thing is skills. So skills is an area which, obviously, as a company, we are not perhaps the most knowledgeable on, but we have done quite a lot. And usually we do that then together with national education facilities, as well as with NGOs that are the true experts in this. So Vodafone Foundation, and that's pure charitable working, charitable giving, in Germany, Greece, Hungary, Netherlands, Romania, and Spain, for example, has already provided digital skills development for 3 million kids in those countries. And we are very devoted to expand that program. So to give you a concrete example, what we're doing is we're investing 20 million over the next 5 years to help 16 million learners in 13 European countries to basically boost their digital skills. And similarly work with UNHCR to target refugees. And we have a commitment to provide education for 500,000 refugee children, which are, of course, very much on the outside of all access to both information and to modern education that allows them to reintegrate into the societies that they find themselves. So there's a lot that we can do in this space as a company, but more importantly, we always do that in collaboration with national institutions, education institutions, as well as NGOs.
Well, let me come, picking up on your zero-rated, for those who aren't sure, zero-rated services are simply those that they don't count against your balance, they won't cost you extra money to drain your data. This was done during the pandemic. Is this something that should just be rolled out indefinitely if we really believe strongly in educating?
Well, I think the basic problem that states have to ask themselves is, on one part, on a personal level, I can say, well, yeah, it makes sense. On the other hand, it's not for free. This drives an enormous amount of traffic. So the state then will have to find a way of funding it, because you have, by the way, the same. We zero-rated all access to a healthcare site. So no one should struggle with a data bundle in order to access, say, NHS or the German National Health facility, or consulting a doctor in the midst of a COVID crisis. I think that was the right thing to do in the crisis situation we're in. That's not a functioning way of operating a society long term, because it's private investment that drives basically the investment into the infrastructure. So the cost needs to be recovered. But generally speaking, that's why we're arguing very much as Vodafone for more collaboration between the state and the private sector in co-investment into the network, because it fulfills such an important societal function.
Okay, I'm going to come back to questions from our audience. Andreas, there's a lot of questions regarding how did you distinguish between opinion and fact? That question there from Anastasia, and I see also quite a few people getting into the nitty-gritty of that on Twitter, as you probably wouldn't be surprised to learn. What was the methodology there?
Oh, we presented young people with tasks where they, some information was real and some was fake, and they had to sort of distill that from. There was one particularly unit entirely devoted to this, but generally, we regard performance at levels 5 and 6, the kind of reading strategies that you have to reach those levels, as the ones that really differentiate that capacity. No?
Okay, and now we also have another question, I think, Andreas, probably for you as well. Critical thinking and creative thinking are perhaps two sides of the same coin. I wonder if critical reading skills support of creative thinking digitally? Is that something that you perhaps looked into?
Yeah, actually, the next PISA round will look in more detail into the creative thinking aspect. Both are related, whether the same coin, I'm not sure. I think creative thinking is more about your capacity to generate original ideas, to assess the originality of your thinking and so on. It's more the imaginative side, whereas critical thinking is more your capacity to evaluate, to assess, to relate. But both are obviously very, very important in the world in which we live. Critical thinking is actually something that is straightforward to assess. So we have been able to do that for some years in the PISA context. Creative thinking is something that we are still working on, because with creative thinking, you cannot anticipate the answers that students will give you. You have to basically devise an assessment that is really allowing for divergent and creative imagination. So we're working on that, but that's going to happen in a year in the next PISA round.
Okay, well, another question I want to get to that's perhaps for all panelists is the importance of digital literacy skills is obviously sometimes seen as very much as a career-driven focus or something that you will need to advance your job. But at the same time, we've got to think broader than that and think about democratic development and the wider social world. Joakim, is there are these two different ways of thinking about digital literacy being, if you like, siloed and separated off, or should we be thinking about them together, as it were? And I want to come back to Andreas as well as that, because we think about teaching practices as well.
No, I think I don't think you should be linear in understanding education systems. Education system is to create successful and citizens that are able to fulfill their dreams, no matter what their dreams are. And therefore, I don't think we should embrace a sort of a very practical approach where you say digital skills is necessary in order to be a productive member of the labor market in the future, which is probably true. But that's not the point here. The point is, and that's basically goes back to what Andreas said early on, where he said, don't think about digital literacy as just a technique. I think about it as a digital skill. So yes, in order to capture digital skills, in order to, as digital becomes mainstream, no matter the sector what you go into, you need to be able to navigate digital tooling. But our second point is digital enlightenment. That's where you get to all the things around critical thinking, critical reading, being able to become fulfill your life dreams no matter what they are, in a world where digital and real, if you want, or digital and the normal economy interacts. And then finally, digital resilience. Resilience is the key part of you being able to protect yourself in this environment, which is of course very difficult with the way that you are accessing information and sometimes hate speech or similar things that are happening on the internet, but also resilient as a member of a public discourse and member of a democracy. This is not about a linear relationship with corporates needing to recruit a lot of IC technicians. This is about the type of citizens we would like to have that are successful and able to fulfill whatever they are aspiring to. That's the core objective of this.
Viviane, I see you nodding there. That's obviously something you agree with.
Yes, totally. And I would also very much concur with those who say, well, this is an issue for everybody. It's not only for young people, obviously. And as was said before, this discussion focuses on education, but I believe that digital skills and competencies and digital literacy is really something for lifelong learning. Irrespective of people's age. So this is another aspect, and I think it merits equally to be addressed. Now, when we talk about the value and the role of digital competencies in society, I think it also leads to another thought, which was also already touched upon, which is indeed, digital transformation in education and training is probably the responsibility of the entire society. And there I would say that civil society foundations play a key role in this approach, which is, I would say, a multi-stakeholder approach. And we need to bring in, I think, experience from very different sectors, from different countries, and in particular from people who have real expertise on the ground, practitioners and people who are really exposed on a daily basis to challenges and opportunities. I'm saying this because that's very much the spirit in which we will now implement also a digital education action plan in this multiple stakeholder approach. This is just to say digital competencies is much more than what it could look like at the surface in terms of what it means for the development of our societies.
Andreas, did you see any interesting trends emerging between education systems that, to put it broadly, view education as training up a young worker versus those that train up someone who is going to be a happy, productive member of society?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. In fact, I believe that, that may have been a very relevant question 50 years ago. I think today those two worlds are becoming increasingly integrated. What is important for what will be important for life will be important for the functioning in our democracies. Now, it's your capacity to live with yourself, your capacity to live with other people, your capacity to live with the planet. I think it all comes to very similar skills. So I do think that actually in the past, you could see it. Some education systems are very kind of vocationally oriented, equipping people with a specific skill set for a specific jobs. Others more, transversally oriented. Today, I think that is no longer a relevant distinction. And we have to educate people for jobs that have not been created, to use technologies that have not been invented, to solve social problems that we cannot yet imagine. And I think this is something, it requires a very, very broad kind of foundations. That's also why I think we should distinguish between digital literacy and technology skills. Technology is time-bound. It's going to evolve. It's going to look very, very different in the world of tomorrow. The kind of our mental capacities to actually deal with this. No? If you don't understand an algorithm, you're going to become the slave of an algorithm. I think our mental capacities, they will be enduring. They will be, I think, something that will have kind of a long shelf life. And I think that's what we need to invest more. That's why I'm also, thinking often quite skeptical about, should we teach everybody coding in school? Well, by the time young people will graduate, they may ask yourself, remember me, what was coding? Things might have evolved totally different. I think it's more about, computational thinking, understanding the ideas of the digital world, being able to navigate complex information. And I think actually that's where, public policy. And I think I really like the digital action plan of the European Union on this. So those kinds of instruments are very much needed. We can't put this all on the shoulders of individual teachers in schools. We need to, in the product market, we are much better in this. We have very strong regulatory kind of environments that prevent you from, eating poisonous food and doing all of this. In the knowledge world, we need to rely on the enabling factors, on the skills of people. And I think that requires very strong policy tools when it comes to the quality of the instruments, the learning environments. And I think that's, and most of them go across borders. That's, I think, why, work of in the context of the European Union is so important. This is no longer kind of a school-based or a regional or a national phenomenon. This is really something that extends across different contexts. And so I think, we should no longer distinguish between, or the idea of education is no longer to prepare. We used to learn to do the work, and now learning is the work. I think that's the real differentiator.
Sorry, could I add just
a year-old question, but I learned to sound edit with tape and a pencil, so perhaps times. But I also want to ask you, what do you see maybe are the barriers to achieving these goals? Is there anything holding Europe back, say, or other parts of the world that you've identified?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to, if we want to learn new things and teach new things, we have to ask ourselves, what can we let go? And we're not very good at this. Our education systems in Europe have become a mile wide and just an inch deep. We teach a lot of stuff in very superficial depths. And a lot of this is carried from the past and has basically very low relevance for tomorrow's world. And, in a way, I think teaching fewer things at greater depths, not teaching you lots of figures and facts in math and science, but teaching you to think like a scientist. Now, can you design an experiment? Can you distinguish, things that are, relevant for science and that are not subject to scientific inquiry. Can you think like an historian? Now, history is not about names and places. It's about your capacity to understand how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it developed, how it advanced, and sometimes how it unraveled when the context changed. I think those ways of thinking, they should get much greater emphasis today. And I think the barrier today is, this very kind of superficial way of teaching lots of stuff. Then we have institutional barriers. We have a very industrial school system. Basically all students learn in the same way, kind of in a very kind of mechanistic way. And technology there, can make learning so much more granular, so much more interactive, so much more personal. I think there are a lot of barriers that we will need to overcome to educate young people for their future rather than for our past. No?
Joakim, I think you wanted to jump in there with a comment on our last discussion,
If you allow me, I think Andreas touched upon something which is very, very important when he described also the pace of change. So you made I personally think coding will be with us, but it doesn't matter. The key point is what we're dealing with in terms of technological development is a warp speed type of society. So everything is paced up in terms of new technologies. What does that mean? It means that our education system, also from the point of view of digital skills, need to teach people adaptability. So our ability to adapt to new circumstances is absolutely essential. And I think Andreas' point when he describes an industrial system and where, in fact, for me, I just want to call out because this is a really, really important point. If I look at people that are very successful also from a professional career point of view, it is not that they have been doing the same thing all the time. It is that they constantly adapt with the technology. And we just assume that the pace of technology is going to increase. Adaptability as a key feature of being successful as an individual and having a fulfilling life will be essential. And there, I think the education system plays an essential role in learning kids and teaching kids how to be adaptable. And that becomes the foundation upon which they have lifelong learning.
Well, I want to pick up, you mentioned social inclusion a couple of times already. Just broadly, obviously, we all, I think, here agree that critical thinking and digitally critical thinking are ways to enhance social inclusion. Do you see any things that are barriers, Joakim, or any issues there? I mean, obviously there's questions about how kids get taught. There's questions about deprived children who maybe don't have access to the best education services.
I think the question is better to those people that work daily on the education system, Andreas and Viviane. But let me give you my view, which is not that. I think yes, I think we have a lot of barriers, and if I just took a step back and thinking about what technology allows us, and we have yet to embrace in our education system the full benefits of technological change. And that includes, for example, that kids today in Africa through e-learning platforms have access to some of the best universities on the planet. When I was a kid, going to Columbia University would be a massive thing. I mean, just think about how difficult it would be to get in. And growing up in sort of outskirts of Stockholm. Today, through various technological means, kids can have access to some of the best lecturers on the planet. And that's an incredible opportunity. That's what we do with, for example, refugee camps, where we take, Kakuma refugee camp, where particularly young girls have never really been given a fair chance on education. We expose them and put them on a journey where we also access educational material, again, linked to the national curriculum, but we allow them to access digitally educational material from some of the best teachers and universities on the planet. Now, so there are elements of, are we fully embracing the opportunities and thinking big of how we can do it? Then there are a lot of other gaps, and including in the way that the education system is operating, that I think others are better placed to comment on than me.
Well, I know gender gap was one of the things that came up in the PISA report. But Viviane, let me go to you first. How can education systems ensure that those disadvantaged or not left behind, that there are proficient digital readers going forward. And you know, this could be something to do with the digital divide. It could be something to do with either refugees or cultural status. It could be something like children suffering from dyslexia or neuroatypical students. How do we encompass all of that into a form of education and social inclusion?
Thank you very much. You touched upon very different aspects, and I think there are many, many reasons and ways ahead. If you allow, I would just touch upon one aspect which I think is very important, and that's, it sounds very obvious, teachers and educators. They are at the heart of education and training, clearly, and they have the power to guide, inspire, empower young people and help them open new horizons. And I also believe that the role of teachers is changing. They are increasingly adopting the role of coaches and facilitators, moving away from the more traditional, more top-down educational instruction approaches. So still, teachers need to be supported in this process, and that's why I'm replying about teachers, because I think they are really the heart and the starting point of this, and they need to have the confidence that they can do it. And prior to the COVID crisis, when we asked about when the OECD, by the way, asked about the preparedness of the teachers, less than 40% in the EU felt well or very well prepared to use digital technologies for teaching, and there was a significant difference also across countries. So this is something that many of the teachers had to overcome during the crisis. They were faced with challenges, barriers, and they had to make digital technologies part of the everyday process. Now, I think what is important now is that we continue supporting them in developing these new skills and pedagogical approaches. And we are developing common guidelines for teachers and educators to boost all these aspects through, for instance, one of the important ones that we mentioned, disinformation, for instance, through education and training. So we believe that these guidelines should be very practical, because theory and practice are very much linked in this area. And we will set up a group of experts from a variety of stakeholders, academics, parents, young people themselves, international organizations, NGO, technology providers, and so on, because we want to have this very holistic view on it. So I stop for now, but there's so much more to say in this discussion, and it was fascinating. Thank you.
Well, absolutely. And of course, this is where the ongoing all life education goes on for teachers as well. Andreas, I want you to develop on the same points. I listed a lot of potential gaps there. Is proper education and teaching the way to narrow these gaps?
Yeah, first of all, I think we have to realize that during the pandemic, technology has dramatically amplified the many social inequalities in our school systems, in our education systems. That is a reality. You know, those who were able to learn on their own, who had that autonomy, that resilience, the supportive ecosystem around them, they, got amazing opportunities, and those who did not have those kinds of dispositions and support, even if they had the technology, they were very badly left behind. And I think there is a great risk that technology also in the future is going to super empower those with the right skills and leave others further behind. I think that's something that we should take for real, and we should learn from the pandemic. But I also believe, and I'm very much on the same line of thinking as Joakim here, that technology really holds the key to to greater equity in education. First, as Joakim explained, you can now make the best learning resources available to anyone. You can scale, amplify the role of teachers. One teacher can now teach the right people. You can now match, the pedagogical practice with the learning needs of people as we never had before. You can use artificial intelligence to actually understand how different students learn differently. You can use learning analytics to actually give teachers so much better tools. Special needs. You know, those students were left behind in our current school systems. They sit in a corner, they can't, you know, follow the regular instruction because it's one size fits all. With technology, we can actually respond to those learning needs. Is that likely to happen? I must say, I'm not sure. You know, so far I see technology more conserving existing practice than really transforming it. And for me, I think that transition is going to be very absolutely vital. And once again, you know, I don't think it's going to happen, you know, on a national basis. I think it will require a truly kind of global collaboration to imagine the kind of learning approaches, the learning environments. We need to be courageous enough to reconfigure, you know, the time, the space, the people, and the technology to achieve this. I don't think it's a given. You know, it could go either way. It could, to technology could amplify inequality, or it could moderate them and mediate them. It really depends on the kind of intentional strategies that we do put behind it. And I personally believe, you know, the technology part will probably be the easiest. And then the hardest part really comes to the kind of pedagogies that we deploy, how we, you know, support teachers. And again, I think the approach to just train teachers differently is the wrong one. You cannot train people for those things. You need to provide, the school needs to become a place where everybody learns, where students learn, where teachers learn, where the school learns to do things differently. And I think that is a very, very ambitious kind of target. But that's where what is happening in every other part of our societies. I think what we need to realize is that, you know, other parts of our societies have done a lot better to reinvent themselves than we have in the field of education so far.
Well, I talk a lot about in other areas about whether or not we're attempting to force a technological solution on a societal or cultural problem, which is a broader question and not just one for education. Andreas, I'm going to ask you just very briefly in 30 seconds, since we're running short of time, to answer a question here from Praveen, who says, a lot has been spoken about teacher education, teacher training, capacity building. However, in countries like India, the teaching profession hasn't attracted the talent or has been low on priority for career choices. Are there any guidelines or policies that we could put into action? I don't know whether you want to tackle that shortly.
Yeah, you know, I think in some countries we'll need to make teaching financially a little bit more attractive, but I think in many countries we need to make teaching intellectually more attractive. And once again, I think, you know, that's where technology can help by giving teachers better tools, connect them more, make teaching a more collaborative profession. And actually, I think India has many good examples. It's actually an amazing country where, you know, the average may be very low, but you find a lot of really innovative teaching and learning going on. So I think it's really about creating a work organization that becomes more attractive to talented people. And it's not just about salaries. It's actually, in Europe, it's the least problem. The salaries of teachers is the least worry you have. It's really about the work organization environment that gives people, you know, more interesting jobs.
Okay, we've 3 minutes left. That, if I keep my comments short, is a minute to each of you to wrap up. Viviane, let me hand to you first. What's your one overriding message, your one takeaway from today's event?
I think that the issue that we have been discussing has so many different facets and aspects that it is really a matter of now working together across sectors, across countries. And this is what I take away from this discussion, which opened many more questions that need to be addressed, I think, in this way. So it's really a multifaceted, stakeholder and countries approach. So this is what I would take away. And I would also like to thank you, you for the moderation, Joakim, Andreas, for the very, very important insights, and the audience in the chat. For me, it was a fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Joakim, I asked more questions than we answered. What are the next steps?
You know, what are the next steps? I mean, for me, so first, thanks a lot to everyone who participated. And it is an area where we are very, very keen to help in whatever way we can. I just want to call out both the urgency created by the pandemic in the sense of the risk of a lost generation, but also the opportunity in the sense that, to Andreas' point, are we courageous to reinvent systems, in this case of education? We have the same question in the healthcare system, by the way, and we have had the same question as a company. If you take us as a company, we never thought that we could move almost 100% of our staff to work from home environment. We would run 25% of the world's internet from a bunch of kitchens, bedrooms, and stuff like that. That was completely out of the question. So the COVID has shown us the art of the possible. We can push the boundaries of what is possible, and I just want everyone to embrace that. And in line with Viviane, that's going to require a multi-stakeholder approach, and we would be very honored to play a small part and lean into the big stride that Andreas and Viviane is shepherding.
Andreas, I'll leave the final word to you. Of course, we have the link to the report that we're going to be pushing people to try and read the whole thing, and your slides will be available. But any final closing thoughts?
Yeah, just one aspect that we haven't discussed very much, and that's the international comparative perspective. And I think that gives me hope that there are some education systems that are doing so much better than others. Now, why is Estonia doing so much better than France or Germany? Why is China doing so much better than most countries on the Western world in this, or Singapore? I think there are solutions, and there are solutions at scale. I think we should be also more courageous to look not just upward but outward to the world and learn from the best policies and practices.
Thank you, and thank you to all our panelists for our discussion. Thank you to Vodafone for organising today. Inga, I'm going to hand over to you to say the final words. Obviously, the European Commission and the OECD also involved today in running this really interesting event that we had so much engagement from.
Yeah, thanks for your great moderation and this really, really interesting discussion. I learned even a lot, even after reading the report. So I'm really looking forward to implementing these findings and inspirations which we discussed today. And I mean, as I said in the beginning, the Vodafone Foundation is absolutely leaning into this. And we just started a European initiative together with Vodafone Foundations in several European countries to really just do this. Trying to make sure that young people get the skills which they need for the 21st century. So thanks a lot for this great event and for everybody staying that long here together with us and listening to the discussion.
Well, very well said. Nice optimistic hope for the future. Of course, we can all keep talking digitally, so please do share on social media, keep the conversation going, and hopefully we will be back to have another similar webinar someday soon. Have a great rest of your day.